Have you ever noticed how clear, patient, and intentional you are when you teach, and how dense, guarded, or overly cautious your writing can feel? Have you ever wondered why the skills you use effortlessly in the classroom seem to disappear once you open a blank page? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we're talking about what it means to write the way that you teach. We explore why scholars often abandon their strongest pedagogical instincts when writing for publication, and how academic norms quietly push us toward opacity instead of clarity. So let's dive in. So whenever I was very first starting out in my career as a teacher, I was teaching a class in qualitative research methods, as I still do. And one of the ways that I teach students how to write research is by reading a whole lot of research that other people have done and really working through how people have made choices in their prose in order to show students the different ways that one can advance an argument, synthesize or summarize, or whatever it is that they're trying to do in that particular piece of writing. Whenever I'm doing this, I often use research from faculty in my department, including my own scholarship, because I want students to realize that the instructors that they are interacting with on a daily basis are not only good teachers, good mentors, all those sorts of things, they're also really good scholars who are publishing really smart things in really good journals, and they might not ever brag about that in class. They might not ever talk about that with their students, but they are doing that work. I'm a fresh teacher in the classroom at this institution. And for that week, the article assignment was one of my articles. And the students come in that day, ostensibly, they have read it and are ready to talk about it. But, they're students. So hit or miss there. But one of them says, I really liked your article. I was like, oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And then she says, yeah, it was just really weird because the way that I feel like you talk with me and you like talk in class, like, I understand you perfectly, but then whenever I was reading this article, like sometimes I just didn't even know what you were trying to say. I was like, well, all right, well, dagger through my heart. And I will say, like, there is room for complexity in our writing. I don't think it does anyone any service to say that the writing that goes on in our academic journals should always be pitched in such a way that John Q. Public can just pick it up and read it, or even that a first-year student in a university could pick up our writing and just read it and apprehend everything out of it. I think that does a serious disservice to the level of expertise that we have, the types of conversation that we're trying to have in our journals. Our audience is other people who are as educated as we are. Other people might come along and do translational research. They might write an article that's for popular press. They might take their findings and then put that through a media outlet. But our journal articles are written for us. They are written for us to advance knowledge. At the same time, I think that there is something to be said about how often I see early career writers who you'll talk to them about what it is that they're passionate about in their research area or the classes that they're teaching. And they can sit there and have a normal, using air quotes here because, we're in higher education, we're all academics, so none of us are normal, but, a normal conversation about those things. But then as soon as they sit down and try to write anything, they write in such an obtuse, alienated, and alienating way that it is almost impossible to understand what it is that they're trying to say. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about writing your research as if you were teaching and really taking a hold of this ethic of being a teacher in our writing rather than just trying to be an expert. So let's dive in. Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea. So before we get into the specific ways of applying this type of mindset, I just want to make sure that I'm being clear here. There is no reason to believe that just using terminology or precise words in and of themselves is some sort of alienating experience for other people and that you shouldn't write like that at all. The idea that we could have the level of complexity in our writing, but write at the 5th grade reading level, which is the average reading level for a U.S. citizen, it's ludicrous, right? Like you can't write at a 5th grade level and send a rocket to the moon or invent or articulate new philosophies or whatever it is that your type of scholarship is. So anyone who says that academic writing in and of itself is a problem. That person is either telling on themselves that they don't understand something, and then they are trying to make that everyone else's problem, when in fact they are the common denominator of that, or it is a bad faith argument. There's some way of writing to the level of specificity our academic ideas in the sort of language of fifth graders. That's ridiculous. But it is to say that sometimes people are writing in ways that I think are written out of a place of ego and defensiveness, and as a result are not invitational to a reader and are not trying to bridge that gap of meaning between you as the author and them as the reader, and instead has a much more hostile and antagonistic feel, where you are trying to defend your intellect, defend your ideas, or have this type of density that is supposed to be a hallmark of intellect. And certainly I'm guilty of this as anyone else. For example, the first thing that I ever published that I thought was in a really good journal, whenever I wrote that, I was right out of my doctoral program. I was getting my first job. And so I was feeling my oats. I felt like I was on top of the world. And I was like, hey, I'm going to write this piece in such a way as to show that I have arrived on the scene, and I'm going to make a splash, and I'm going to put everyone on notice. Now, whenever I read that piece, I'm like, okay, that was 8,000 words. Probably could have been 6, maybe 6,500. There's about 1,500 words there. A little unnecessary, a little belaboring the point a little bit, a little show-offy in terms of how I was deploying language, right? Could have made the argument a little tighter. All that is to say, I understand this impetus, right? There's this belief that if it's really serious writing, if it's really doing deep theoretical work, that it has to be so dense that not only can the public at large not understand it at all, but even a small amount of other academics, the people who are ostensibly your audience, can understand it. And part of that is this idea of, if I have to explain too much, if I have to define my words, if I have to signpost too much, if I have to do too much to guide my reader to what it is that I want them to know, then I'm going to sound unsophisticated. I'm going to sound juvenile. I'm going to sound like I'm a first-year student in English comp class who always has to write out their thesis statement and always has to write out exactly where they're going to go. And that just sounds very banal and spoon-feedy, and I shouldn't have to do that. I should be able to write whatever way that I want to, because I'm the doctor and other people need to listen to my words of wisdom. And as you can imagine, I really don't think that that's a good way of coming to your writing. I don't think it's a good way of coming to your writing because I just don't think that having the mindset that your reader is antagonistic to you is healthy. If you're always sitting down at your computer with this idea that you are in a battle, not just with your ADHD, with the distractions that are going on, the things that are going on in your life, all the things that don't want you to write. But in fact, even the very person who you should be thinking of as wanting to read your writing, that person too is antagonistic to you. Well, then my God, what are we even doing here, right? Like, what a miserable way of approaching your writing, that everything is set against you and even your audience doesn't want you to write. I mean, that's not healthy, right? You have to think that someone out there wants you to write the things that you want to write, wants to read the things that you have written. That's the whole point of doing research, is that other people read and engage in your ideas, and that pushes human knowledge forward. If you are not being understood by other people, then there's no sense in writing, right? You might as well just never write. And so I think one way to sort of shift your mindset about this is to not think of your reader, the reviewers or the editors, or eventually the audience of the journal or your book or whatever it is that you're writing, that those readers are not your evaluators. They're not in a debate with you. They're not antagonistic towards you. Instead, they are like your students. And I don't know about you, but whenever I come into a class, like if I'm teaching a class on interpersonal relationships, they've had interpersonal relationships. They may not have all been good ones, but they've had experiences there. And I can work with those experiences to help them formulate better ideas about how to be in a relationship. But if I'm teaching something like an upper division research methods course, where they might have had an algebra course 3 years ago where they've done some math, but they really don't have any knowledge of advanced statistics. They don't really know how to apply those in a way that would help them test a hypothesis. Like, none of those things are there. So whether my students have some background and experience or they have none of those things, the way that I approach my students, whenever I'm working with them, is how can I make sure that I am teaching this material in a way that it connects to what they already know, or if they don't know anything about it, how can I start to create a foundation for them to know, so that way I can introduce them and teach them those more advanced concepts. So either they already have a foundation and then I'm building on that, or I have to build a little bit of that foundation and then I'm building on that. But either way, my students, in this case, my reader of something that I've written, I think of as someone who is benign, not hostile. They are not my biggest cheerleader because they don't know who I am. It's anonymized. But I have to think on some level that the editor has sent my work to someone that knows enough about my area that they're going to be supportive of the things that I'm going to write. Now, so that's the first thing. And on some level, they're a little bit ignorant. And by ignorant, I don't mean that they're stupid or dumb or that they can't learn things, right? I don't mean it in the pejorative sense. I mean ignorant in the fact that I have some sort of knowledge that my students don't have. My job as a teacher is to help impart that knowledge on them, for them to be able to make it a part of their experiences and their schema, so that way they can build on that knowledge and they can use that in their own lives. Similarly, as a writer, I'm trying to figure out what is it that I need to teach my reader in order for me to get them to the place that I want them to be. Is this a text that I need to write in such a way as it assumes a reader that doesn't know anything about my area? Or is it a text that I'm writing that assumes that my reader is knowledgeable and that when I'm imparting on them is not new knowledge about the area in general, which they already have a firm foundation in, but instead what I'm teaching them is the specific contribution that I'm making, which is the new knowledge that no one knows because I haven't published it yet, right? That's why it's going through the review process. So I think taking this mindset, shifting away from this antagonistic reader to instead, my reader is a student. What do they need to know in order for me to communicate to them the things that are most important about my work, that is the most impactful, that makes it clear to them? I think those are the sorts of questions that animate better writing. So with that in mind, then let's think then a little bit about a sort of pedagogical mindset whenever you're writing your research. What are ways that you can write as a teacher? The first thing that you can think of is much like whenever you're a teacher, you're trying to figure out through the course before you start writing is what is the objective of my writing? So much like a teacher has learning objectives or learning outcomes, these are the things that students should be able to know or do, or the skills and dispositions that they should have by the time the class is over. What is it that you want your reader to understand by the end of the paper? Are you adding on to knowledge in this area? Are you testing a theory? Are you doing something exploratory? Are you making a novel argument? Are you comparing different philosophies? Are you developing a meta-analysis or a review of literature that helps us take kind of a big picture look at what all is going on in the literature? Like, what is it that you are trying ultimately to communicate to your reader by the end of your paper? I think a lot of writers don't really think about this. What they think of is, I have this idea and it's a good one because I'm interested in it. Of course, it's a good idea. I'm the one who had it. And now I'm just going to sit down and I'm just going to keep writing on this thing until I've got 20, 25, 30 pages. And those 20, 25, 30 pages are going to be good, obviously, because I wrote them. As you might imagine, that approach of writing where you're writing from a space of what's interesting to me as the writer might not translate very well to what your readers experience, right? You have to think of your readers whenever you are writing. In this case, by thinking about what your learning outcomes are, what is it that you want your research to do by the end of your reader reading it? That's the first step in you developing your research from this more pedagogical orientation. As you're going through that, then, you might think to yourself how each one of the sections of your paper is serving your goal. So if you take your sections of your paper, whether that's a traditional social science paper like literature review, method, findings or results, discussion, right? Then you can think of each one of those sections as having 1, 2, maybe 3 learning outcomes for each one. What is it that you're trying to convey? As we've talked about, in previous episodes, if you're writing like a method section, you might have participants, procedures, and data analysis as your 3 major sections. So taking the participants section as an example, we might formulate that into learning outcomes. So outcome 1, by the end of this section, my readers should know A, that my participants were selected in a rigorous way, and B, they should know the relevant demographic profiles of my participants. That's what's most important in a participant section. So if you think to yourself, those are my learning outcomes, how do you write in a way that would secure for your reader that you've done those two things. And so each one of your sections, or even subsections, you can formulate into learning outcomes and then think, how am I going to communicate this in a way to my reader that it ensures that they will know this material by the end of my writing? And again, that's a social science example, but even if you're doing more natural science or humanistic research, take each one of your sections and formulate those sections into learning outcomes and think to yourself, how can I write in such a way, or how can I evaluate my writing if you've already written it? How can I evaluate my writing in such a way as to make sure that my readers are meeting my learning outcomes? The second thing to think about is, as you're going through the writing, how are you scaffolding your writing in such a way as to help your reader understand the things that you're trying to communicate to them? So for me, I think that previewing and signposting throughout your writing is very important. In the introduction of your article, the first 4 or 5 paragraphs, I like setting up my final paragraph as an overall preview of what I'm going to do in the major sections of my paper and spending particular emphasis on the findings and the conclusions of my writing. So that way it kind of invites my reader in to read the rest of my manuscript. I also think that, especially in those instances where you have multiple subsections, so for example, in your literature review, you might have literature review might be your overall section header, but you might have a subsection on a theory, and then another subsection on the context, and then another subsection on the body of literature that you are applying the theory to. In that case, you have 3 different subsections. Well, in that case, I would say after you have your section called literature review, you might have 1 paragraph that does sort of the preview signposting work of the major things that are going on in that section. And again, I think that sometimes people act as if this is overwriting things or if this sort of dumbs down our writing. I think you can still talk about really important, really complicated, really nuanced things, but there's no reason for your prose itself to be the reason that people can't read your writing. So in addition to like previews and signposts, another thing that I would say is making sure that good topic sentences in your paragraphs are important. If you go back in previous episodes, I've talked about how to create really good, compelling paragraphs, and topic sentences are the very foundation of a good paragraph. If your topic sentence isn't really the star of the show, then the rest of your paragraph is not to function well. If your topic sentence is not doing a good job of directing your reader, then the rest of the stuff in your paragraph is not going to make sense to your reader. And so making sure that your topic sentences are declarative, you're not opening your paragraphs with quotes, but instead you're using those topic sentences as really good signposts for what's going to go on in the rest of that paragraph is imperative for your reader to know what it is that you're talking about. Finally, I would say it's really important for you to remind readers where they are and why it matters. I think it's important to do this in your findings and in your discussion or implications section. So whenever I get to my findings or results, I oftentimes will restate my research questions or my hypotheses, because a reader who has read those research questions or hypotheses then had to read a methods section. That's 2 or 3 pages. And so by the time that they get down to the findings or results, they may not remember exactly what it is that I asked them. So I can say, in this study, I was interested in, and then rewriting my research question or my hypotheses then as a declarative sentence that goes in right there, and then explaining why that was an important question to ask or why it was an important hypothesis to forward. And then I can get into my actual results, whether that's the themes that I'm trying to generate or the results of my statistical tests and whether my hypotheses were supported or not, and the relevant statistical information. Then I'm going to also do this whenever I get to my implications or discussion section. So there I might say again, in this study, I was looking at X, Y, or Z, and we found this, that, and the other. This is important because, and then I outline all the reasons why it's important. And then I say something along the lines of, and now I'm going to detail why those things matter to the literature on this subject and also to further practice. And then I'll have 2 subsections. One's my theoretical implications, one's my practical or pragmatic implications. All that is to say that first paragraph is there to set up why this is important to my reader and why they should read all the other things that I'm going to write about in this section. What some people will say is that this is overwriting your work. But I would say the good thing about this is that if you're writing in this way, you can put it in, and if your reviewers or your readers never say anything about it, good. That means that it was needed and necessary and they appreciated you writing in that style. If you write it and a reviewer says, this seems very overwritten, cool. you can take it out because you've written in such a way in other areas that you don't need to do so much explicit signposting. But to me, I always err on the side of being a teacher. I always err on the side of my reader is someone who I am teaching this thing to. And it's always better, in my experience, to be more explicit with students than less explicit, whether that's about due dates or content or anything else. And so I always err on the side of putting on my pedagogical hat and saying, how can I teach this person better? That's by being explicit about the things that I'm trying to communicate to them. The final thing that I would say is that it's going to be important for you to think about where you might get confusion in your writing. And I say this because there might be places where you get confusion, regardless of how well you write. Some ideas are, by their very nature, complex, they're challenging, they're counterintuitive, they just take more cognitive work on the part of a reader to get through. And so you have to think to yourself, where is it that my prose is adding confusion? And where is it where my content itself is confusing? The content part, you cannot and certainly should not try to change. For example, whenever people are doing statistical work, they need to report things like reliability coefficients and p-values or omega values or whatever it might be for their statistical tests. You can't just take that stuff out, right? Like, yeah, that's going to be jargon, incomprehensible gibberish to 95% of the population. But for those of us who know what those things mean, those are indicators of quality, they're indicators of rigor, they're indicators that you know what you're doing. You can't just not put that stuff in there because most people don't understand it. So if it's a content issue, you might not make any change there because some content by its very nature is exclusive to this group of people. On the other hand, if your prose is getting in the way, that's a problem. And so you might think to yourself, if you had a student read this, where would they get lost? Where might they ask for examples? As you're thinking about this, you might work through your writing and think to yourself, where are areas that I might need to write in examples or clarifying sentences in order to really make sure that my audience knows what it is that I'm talking about. To me, again, if you put in example sentences, that's going to, on one hand, that's going to increase your word count. That's going to make it harder for you to put in other types of information. But it doesn't matter how important it is that your findings are, how good your synthesis of your literature review is, or anything else, if people can't read your work and therefore they keep rejecting it. So having clear examples, especially on things that you know are known only to your particular niche of scholars, or if you are introducing new concepts, new ideas, or new takes on the types of scholarship in your area. In those instances, it's very important for you to offer examples and write in a way that invites people to know what it is that you're talking about. Overall, what I would say is that I think a lot of times people write in this place of defensiveness and overcompensation for what they perceive to be an antagonistic relationship between themselves and reviewers. And as a result, they think that writing in a way that invites reader understanding is too basic. It makes it seem like it's not rigorous enough, and that if people can understand this, then I'm not doing my job as a scholar. But honestly, I think that if you really know your stuff, I think that if you're really confident in your ideas, then you would write it in a way that makes it easier for people to know what it is you're saying and either make an informed decision on whether they agree with you or disagree with you. Hiding your voice, hiding what it is that you're trying to say through bad prose is not a sign of intellectual might. To me, it is a sign that you are not confident that the things that you're writing are the best contribution to your area of scholarship. I will also say that as an editor, I have never seen in all of my time editing either this journal or for others a reviewer ask for less clarity. Nor have I, as a reviewer, ever asked for less clarity. I have only ever asked for more examples, better signposting, more concise or precise language in the writing. I've only ever seen or been a part of instances where you're asking writers to be better at communicating their ideas, not worse. And so I think that if you reframe this and you think of writing as a way of teaching and teaching itself as evidence of mastery, like you cannot teach things unless you know them. I think it was Albert Einstein who said, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. And yeah, any type of information can be explained simply. Now, what simple means, again, varies on your audience. I'm not talking about us writing your prose at the 5th grade level. That's not what we're talking about. What I am saying is that you can write it in a way that makes it easy for your reader, who is of equal intelligence and training as you, to read and understand and evaluate your work. You can make it easy and simple for them to read that rather than making it difficult and hard. Because if you're doing the latter, it seems like it comes from a place of you not being confident enough in your ideas and having a defensive and antagonistic relationship, which is just not a good place to be in as a writer. As you're thinking about how to put this into practice, what I would say is that think about what your research idea is, try to develop that idea into a 20 or 30-second pitch. Then say that to a colleague you trust and that might have enough background in your area to kind of give you some feedback. If you can explain that idea to them in 20 or 30 seconds, it's a good idea. And it's probably one that you have a firm enough grasp on that you can start writing on and developing an outline of. After those 20 or 30 seconds, they have a lot of questions. And not questions like, oh, that's a really cool idea, I have questions, but like, I don't understand what it is that you're trying to get at questions. Or if you say, I'm going to try to tell you this in 30 seconds, and then you end up taking 3 minutes. In either of those two instances, then what you have there is an idea that you do not have mastery of enough yet in order for you to be able to communicate that in your writing. You need to sit down and think through and work through it some more. If you try to explain it to someone and they have a whole bunch of questions because they don't understand it, and so then you find yourself answering all these questions and maybe even feeling a little bit defensive about all the questions that they're asking. That's not a good place to be because that means that you are not communicating your ideas in a way that invites a reader. Okay, so that's going to be about it for me, folks. The last thing that I will say is that most of you who are listening to this, maybe you're students who are listening to this because of a class that's been assigned to you, or maybe you haven't taught a class yet. But I think all of us on some level have been in a situation, whether formally or informally, where we have taught others. And certainly all of us have been in situations where we have been taught. And so I really want you to think about what are those things that you have found to be effective, both as a teacher and as a learner, and how can you apply those things to your writing? And I think that if you do that, what you're going to find is that as a teacher, I don't know about you, but for me, I feel an incredible amount of gratitude and appreciation for my students whenever I get to teach them. I get to be in a place where I help them develop their ideas and help them become better than they were before they walked through the door. And I take that very seriously. And so whenever I write like that, I write from a much more generous place and a much more joyous place than whenever I think to myself, oh, my students are a bunch of nitwits who never do the things that I tell them to do and don't follow directions and never turn things in on time. Like whenever I have that relationship with students, that antagonistic relationship with them, that makes me not want to teach in the same way that thinking of my reviewers as a bunch of numbskulls who don't appreciate my work, well, now all of a sudden I don't like writing anymore. So I think having this different frame of reference is going to be helpful. As always, if you have ideas that you want me to talk about on the podcast, please send them my way. I'm happy to give you a shout out if you want me to, or you can remain anonymous, but I want to make this a podcast that's helpful for you. So send them my way if you want to. And if you're interested in my coaching services, give me a shout out. My contact information is in the podcast description. You can always have a 30-minute appointment for free, and then we can talk about whether or not you want to have my coaching services after that. But other than that, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in next week's episode.
Hey, co-authors. What's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.